From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Colorado lawmakers head back to the state capitol earlier than expected on Thursday for a special session to fix a $750 million hole in the state budget. Now, if this feels like deja vu, it is, sort of. Earlier this year, state legislators addressed a $1.2 billion shortfall during the regular session, and they balanced the state budget. But then President Trump signed into law his budget bill, known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, passed by Republicans in Congress. That bill's rewriting of the federal tax code punched a hole in Colorado's budget. It created an instant $750 million shortfall for the state. State lawmakers now face tough decisions as they try to close the gap while they minimize the impact of this on Coloradans. To help explain how we got here and how lawmakers might fix the problem, we are joined by KUNC State House reporter Lucas Brady Woods. Hi, Lucas.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having me.
Colorado is more vulnerable to changes to the federal tax code than most other states. Without getting too much into the details, Lucas, why is the state suddenly seeing this loss in revenue from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill?
Well, like you said, Colorado is especially susceptible to the things that this bill does, and that's because our tax code is actually linked to the federal tax code. That makes things easier for Coloradans when they file their taxes because there's just one tax rate that you have to worry about on the federal and the state level. But at the same time, now that makes the state susceptible to the changes in income tax revenue that the Big Beautiful Bill implements. We're actually one of only 4 states in the country that links our tax code to the federal tax code in this way. So while we had a balanced budget, like you said, after the regular session, the day after this bill was signed, that got out of whack because of this link to the federal tax code.
How unusual is it to have a federal spending bill lead to the need for a 5-day special session here in Colorado?
It seems pretty unusual. In my years covering the legislature, we've seen some special sessions, but not because of things happening at the federal level. This is a hit to this fiscal year's budget, which means lawmakers want to get ahead of that and start early with the changes they have to make up for the gap so that they can spread it out over the whole year as opposed to waiting until their regular session in January.
Lucas, a $750 million deficit feels a little abstract when the state budget is about $44 billion. How is all this going to affect our day-to-day lives?
Well, the general fund pays for a lot of things that Coloradans rely on. State agencies like the health department, the state labor department. The labor department are those people that serve businesses and workers. We could see cuts to state agencies. We could see cuts to tax credits for families with children. And Colorado has to cover things with its budget like nutrition assistance and SNAP. Some federal money goes to programs like that, but that money is going to be cut, and therefore the state has to step in and try to make up those differences. That applies to free school lunches. We might see some changes there and some money moving around to make sure free school lunches continue to be funded. Another thing that lawmakers are going to try to tweak to make sure that the state covers is Medicaid eligibility for healthcare services at Planned Parenthood, for example. And of course, Planned Parenthood provides a whole slew of healthcare services, and all these things could be hit, and that affects a lot of Coloradans on the ground.
So really, those federal tax cuts in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill really changed a lot for Colorado.
Yeah.
So Colorado will collect less tax revenue than expected. Does that mean the state's revenue is getting a haircut across the board? Are some areas seeing an especially big loss in funding?
It's pretty much across the board. I mean, this bill, this federal measure, really changed how especially corporate income taxes are worked out. That's the biggest hit to the state. It also makes changes to how individual income tax is also collected to a lesser extent, but that will also have a big hit. So that money, that tax revenue that Colorado collects, is used to fund things across the board from the general fund. So the tax revenue basically pays for everything.
Let's talk about how lawmakers will respond during this special session that begins on Thursday. What options are on the table for lawmakers to make up this drop in revenue?
They're going to focus on a few things. One of the biggest things they're going to focus on is closing tax loopholes for businesses. And that could look like a lot of technical, various things that they're going to, try to tweak. Mm-hmm. But like I said, corporate tax income is one of the biggest impacts from this bill. And so they're going to try to tweak how much money, businesses can write off on their taxes and have more of that come to the state instead of being written off, if that makes sense. Yeah. They're also going to probably tap into the state reserves, which are usually held, and the recommendation is to hold them at about 15%, but they're probably going to tap into about 2% of that. And that's the state's rainy day fund, that the state uses during economic downturns, recessions, that kind of thing. This is some of the biggest revenue hits that the state has seen since the Great Recession.
Wow.
And so this is pretty big. So we had much less reserves then. We have more reserves now. So they're going to use a little bit of that to cover some of these changes. And they're also going to have to cut existing spending, but it remains to be seen how much we're going to see that during the session itself.
Well, Democrats control the state legislature, as they have for the last several years. Where are lawmakers looking to make these cuts?
Like I said, we may not see these cuts during the special session itself. They may pass the actual responsibility of making the cuts onto the governor, and he might look at making these cuts executively, deciding where to make the cuts himself. I have heard from lawmakers that they really want to try to preserve education funding, especially K-12 funding, as much as possible. They don't really want to touch that.
I mentioned that Democrats have control of the state legislature. Lucas, how have Republican state lawmakers responded to this current situation?
They're using this as an opportunity to call out Democrats for their tendency to spend. And Republicans have said that we wouldn't be in this situation if Democrats hadn't overspent in recent years. The problem with that argument is that we had a balanced budget at the end of this year's regular session in May, and up until this federal bill passed, the state budget was balanced. That's required in state law to have a balanced budget. And this, so-called one big beautiful bill really has directly hit the state budget and caused these deficits directly.
Lucas Brady Woods is KUNC State Capitol reporter. Lucas, thanks so much for talking with me.
Always a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
The special session begins Thursday and is expected to last 5 days. Lawmakers may try to squeeze in a few other issues, like pausing Colorado's wolf reintroduction program to save money, or working to fend off expected hikes in health insurance premiums. You'll find links to read more of our state capitol coverage in our show notes and at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.